Welcome to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's weekly podcast on the big stories of the day. My name is Ambryn Zaman, and I'm a roving staff correspondent for Al Monitor based in London. Today we'll be looking at Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's curious relationship with Russia's Vladimir Putin. Since Erdogan rose to power 2 decades ago, the two countries have grown steadily closer. Turkey's NATO allies aren't amused, and least of all the United States. Turkey's acquisition of Russian S-400 missiles triggered an earthquake in US-Turkish ties. Some nonetheless argue that Erdogan's open line to the Russian leader is an asset, allowing vital deals to be struck, as when Erdogan, together with the UN, brokered an agreement with Putin to let Ukrainian grain to be shipped to world markets. Yet the two leaders have butted heads, notably over Syria. With us here today to discuss this bumpy bromance is Mayak Galeotti, a widely acclaimed expert on Putin and Russia. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thanks for having me on your show.
First of all, do you agree with the premise that that Putin would like to see Erdogan remain in power, and if so, why? Why does he like strongmen if that's, the case?
Yeah, exactly. I think this is precisely the point. Yes, he'd like to see Erdogan remain in power, not because he has a particular thing about Erdogan specifically, but he thinks it's the best option for him, precisely because he feels he can deal with strongmen. If we look at his relationship with Erdogan, it's gone through some very profound downs as well as ups.
Right.
Like in 2015, following the shoot down of the Russian bomber in southern Turkey, but also sort of carrying out operations in northern Syria, following the assassination of the Russian diplomat and so forth. But in a way, Putin doesn't have a problem with other figures who, like him, strongly support their own country's national interests. Is what he expects. He finds that so much easier to deal with than what he thinks of as the sort of sanctimonious hypocrites of Western Europe. So I think from his point of view, Erdogan is the best choice for him in Turkey.
Is there an equivalent of an Erdogan in his life? Because, so often it's people who are beholden to him, like Assad, like Kadyrov, others, whereas Erdogan is a pretty tough guy himself, very macho. And, we saw this sort of posturing that went on. Do you remember when, after the Russians killed tons of Turkish soldiers, that was in early 2020, then Erdogan had to sort of crawl to Moscow and then was kept waiting with a portrait of Catherine the Great or something. Is that the kind of thing he does? Does he try to humiliate people? Is that part of his MO, especially if they're sort of perceived as standing up to him in some way? Does he feel rub people's noses and stuff?
Absolutely. This is the man who keeps world leaders waiting, all the time. This is a man who, knowing that Angela Merkel is afraid of dogs, allowed his big black Labrador, Connie, into the room when she was having a meeting with him.
Oh, God.
Putin plays these rather spiteful mind games all the time. But the interesting thing is that we most recently saw Erdogan keeping Putin waiting.
Well, precisely, yes. And that was sort of...
And I think this is the essence of their relationship. In some ways, look, Erdogan can often out-Putin. If one thinks about after that bomber shoot-down, Putin was clearly visibly furious.
Yes.
I remember seeing the footage of him talking, and there were sanctions on tourism to Turkey and Turkish agricultural products and that kind of thing. But Erdogan basically didn't back down, and eventually it was the Russians who effectively backed down. Erdogan issued a non-apology apology of the sort of I'm sorry I had to shoot down your plane variety, and the Russians essentially accepted that and went on. So, and likewise, if one looks at what happened in the Nagorno-Karabakh war most recently,
right?
Ultimately, the Russians had to acknowledge and accept Turkey having a role in an area that Russia has historically regarded its sphere of influence. So, so absolutely, Erdogan can play Putin at his own game.
So in Syria,
on an emotional... Sorry.
I'm sorry I interrupted you, but please don't forget what you were about to say. But just to get back to Syria, where you said he basically Putin had to back down. Why? Because doesn't he kind of have the upper hand in Syria, where he can unleash all these refugees on Turkey and stuff like that? To
an extent, though, interestingly, when he does that, though, actually that also arms Erdogan against the European Union, because then kind of conversely Erdogan then pivots to EU and say, oh, seriously, if you think we're going to control all these refugees while you still keep us at arm's length, so actually, ironically, that's an area in which it's, Erdogan also gains from it. But I think genuinely and generally, as I said, I think it's that sort of Putin, he tries his hand often. That's very much the essence of Putinism. He's an opportunist. He tries his hand. And if it doesn't seem to be working, then he pivots to something else.
So he's very similar to Erdogan. They're identical in that manner.
Absolutely. No, I think there's a great degree of similarity. So, yeah, sure. Russia could have done more things to up the ante on Turkey. But when it comes down to it, Turkey can also cause Russia significant problems within Syria. But more broadly, Turkey was and still is a very useful weapon against the West. In that it is this sort of, basically because Erdogan plays this game of playing off Russia against whether it's NATO or the European Union or the Americans, actually it was more convenient for Russia to basically pally up with him again, rather than continue this struggle.
So that's my next question. Is Turkey of greater value to Putin inside or outside NATO? Because it seems to me inside he can be more of a disruptive force than if he broke off with NATO, but maybe you disagree. Maybe the loss of Turkey would be so huge that would be greater for him.
I think that it's not actually, let's be honest, Turkey, it's part of NATO and it's treaty bound that if, Russian army invaded Estonia or whatever, it should get involved. We'd wait and see if that actually happened. But, given that that's not exactly a likely scenario, I think from Putin's point of view, it is more useful to have Turkey inside NATO, particularly because actually of the contrast between NATO membership but not EU membership. I've certainly heard, I'm sure you have as well, Turks very disgruntled saying, great, Europe is happy to let Turks die for its security,
right,
but not happy to actually let it into the club.
Right.
So, that's a continuing point of sort of festering dissatisfaction that is very useful for Moscow's point of view. But on the other hand, if let's say, Turkey either withdrew from NATO or was kicked out of it, that also would be useful because you would have an angry, discontented Turkey. You would have all kinds of recriminations within NATO itself. I think this is it. Sort of, we often think of, I think wrongly, Putin as an initiator. Instead, he's actually often just simply someone who sees what opportunities arise and will take advantage of it. So I think, he can play it either way. But on balance, I think he would rather Turkey to be part of NATO.
An extremely pragmatic guy. So on Ukraine, and I know this isn't what we're meant to be talking about and you have limited time, but just out of curiosity, did he really fuck things up? Did he get it wrong? Is he too emotionally invested and that's why he can't make the U-turn that he does in other areas?
Yeah. I think he genuinely. I was sort of first thinking, wow, how could he make such a mistake, and why was he so daring? Because Putin usually is very risk averse,
right,
for all the macho posturing, and I think it is clear that he had convinced himself, and no one was kind of dared tell him otherwise, that this was going to be a quick and easy operation. That basically 2 weeks and it would pretty much all be over. Because, he has a particular bee in his bonnet about Ukraine that he believes isn't a real country. And he thought more or less that the state would collapse and the people would welcome the Russians in the main. But I think this is it. Having committed himself to that, and more to the point, having suffered severe losses in that initial phase, Putin is aware that if he just simply said, oh, well, it was worth a go, didn't work out, never mind, and pulled out. I mean, firstly, that Western sanctions wouldn't just disappear overnight. And secondly, that people within their own country will be saying, well, hang on, you think of all these massive costs and what, for absolutely nothing? I think his point of view is, I think from his point of view, he feels, I think rightly, that this is an existential struggle for his political survival, in the sense that he has to be able to have enough to show that it can at least be spun as worth the blood and treasure that has been committed. And I think this is the problem. He's now in a position where there's always that sense of, well, one more push. Maybe next month Western will begin to falter and they'll stop bankrolling Ukraine. Maybe next month we'll be able to.
So this is like a gambler at the casino who can't stop, who keeps thinking, well, next time I'll hit the jackpot. So how is Turkey's comportment sitting with Putin at this precise moment? I mean, does he feel he's in an okay place with Turkey?
No, I think this is the problem, because at the moment Russia is not in a strong position generally, and from Turkey's point of view, again, given how ruthlessly pragmatic Erdogan is, it's a question of, well, what's in it for me? If one looks at, for example, Russia was very unhappy with the Bayraktar drone sales to Ukraine.
Sure.
But there's nothing they could do about it, especially because Turkey continues to have this crucial strength, which is control of access and egress from the Black Sea.
Right.
Given that Russia knew that it couldn't really push things too far, because it relies on the Turks, quite frankly, to stop too much NATO shipping coming into the Black Sea. Again, it's had to swallow a lot. So I think very much from Erdogan's point of view, on the one hand, he's happy to present himself as the broker who can make deals, as in the grain deal, because it enhances his international status. And because he genuinely is someone who, both the Ukrainians and the Russians can talk to. But Erdogan's not going to be doing them any favours, the Russians any favours, and Putin knows that. But as I said, I think ultimately he can be annoyed at specific things, but ultimately Putin understands pragmatic strongmen, being one himself, and therefore he doesn't let it get to him the way he clearly is on a visceral level, angered by democratic Western politicians whom he really doesn't understand and who he feels don't understand him.
That's very interesting. So how would policy making on Turkey inside the Kremlin be done?
Well, this is interesting because, this is a system that I call an adhocracy, in that often the people who are actually in charge of policy are not, it's not whatever happens to be on the plaque on their door or on their business card. Now, Turkey is interesting because it's one of the relatively few important areas where the foreign ministry still has considerable input. The foreign ministry has become so shrunk, and the foreign minister, Lavrov, is just so much less of a mover and shaker these days. But Turkey is an area in which actually, for a whole variety of reasons, first because there's a pretty strong cadre of Turkish specialists and Turkish speakers within the foreign ministry.
The Orientalists.
Yeah, exactly. Lavrov himself, actually works quite well with his Turkish counterpart, I understand. But also because you might say one of the main sort of alternative figures who usually would sort of usurp these roles, the Secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, is actually, his particular focus is the Balkans.
Uh-huh.
And so in some ways that kind of excludes him from also being the Turkey point man. Because it's very hard to, on the one hand, be a sort of, playing the Russian hand in the Balkans without actually running the risk of alienating Turkey. So this allows the Russians to basically kind of, Lavrov can be the nice guy, the good cop, and Patrushev can be the bad cop.
Interesting. That's very interesting. But ultimately it's down to Putin, right, to make the big decision. It's
down to Putin, but again, we've got to realise that, it's very much, who briefs him and so forth. He makes top-level decisions or intervenes whenever he kind of fancies it. But again, often the way the Russian system works is people pitch ideas to the boss rather than the boss having the ideas. And so what we've got is it's a three-way process. You've got the foreign ministry. Four ways really. Foreign ministry, you've got Patrushev, you've got the foreign department within the presidential administration, and also you've got the business community, because clearly there are still strong business connections with Turkey. And so in some ways, these are all sources of pitches to the boss. But I think on balance, it's the Foreign Ministry and the Security Council Secretariat that are the most powerful sort of voices.
And where does the intelligence apparatus fit in? Because on the Turkish side, Hakan Fidan, of course, has an outsized role.
I mean, in many ways, Patrushev acts as the sort of the foreman of the intelligence community, with the exception of military intelligence that kind of routes through the Ministry of Defence. But essentially, Patrushev, he was former KGB veteran, former head of the Federal Security Service. So basically, if they're going to play a role, it's generally not direct. It's generally via Patrushev.
And so, how important a role do Russia's state-owned companies play in developing these sort of client relations with countries like Turkey?
I'm first of all, sort of hold up my hand. I'm not essentially an economy specialist. That's not my particular forte. In general terms, there are some kind of figures within that sector who, because they have a strong personal relationship with Putin, acquire an outsized role. There's a man by the name of Sechin who's in charge of Rosneft, who used to be Putin's aide, and who, for example, now has more or less taken over policy, for example, as relates to Venezuela, because of the oil connection.
Interesting.
So you have some individuals, but the point is, I don't think there is anyone like that relating to Turkey. Clearly, there are a whole variety of different enterprises that have interests. But again, none of these are, I think, in and of themselves, really loud voices. Certainly not in Putin's cosmology, who basically regards, enterprises as being there really just to manage the economy for him. He doesn't think of them as business people. He thinks of them as kind of stewards of parts of his domain, who just happen to be in the economic sector rather than anywhere else. They themselves might think of themselves as businessmen, but that's not how Putin thinks of them. So in some ways, I think if when it comes to Turkey policy, if state-owned enterprises are wanting to play a role, they will generally have to do so in alliance with one of those sort of, more significant players. So maybe then, if the foreign ministry wants to do something that actually would be good for, one of the big economic combines, then they will be supporting the foreign ministry.
Well, I was thinking of Rosatom and this nuclear plant in Turkey that, to me, seems to give Russia quite a bit of, leverage. Because, for example, where's the fuel for that going to come from? Russia. It's quite extraordinary, and it's sort of been revealed that it's 100% owned. Even the so-called Turkish company that's the partner has Russian capital. So doesn't that give Russia some power?
Yes and no. I think that people sometimes think that the power is that, Russia could somehow switch off the electricity or something like that. God, it can't do that. And likewise, frankly, if it started to play games with sort of access to nuclear fuel or dealing with the spent fuel, then actually that would just be disastrous for Rosatom's operations worldwide. Because, when people feel, that's proof that we can't trust Rosatom, we should go to Westinghouse or whoever. The interesting thing about Rosatom's campaign generally, not just in Turkey, but generally, we see operations in Hungary and in Finland, attempts to do it in the Czech Republic and so forth, is actually that there is really quite an interesting consensus across the board. So the security interests think, absolutely, this gives us some traction and some power. And it also, because there's going to be lots of engineers and similar going back and forth, it's a great opportunity to also move intelligence officers. And because a lot of the actual work will be subcontracted to local companies, bringing in the concrete or whatever else, that actually gives you considerable degrees of patronage locally. In terms of which companies you wish to support, and again so you begin to acquire a certain degree of weight.
So you do create a client network of some kind through these investments.
Exactly. So that I think is the real security issue. Is that you have a very long-term project, major project, in which lots of Russians will be involved, and there will be a certain amount of patronage. This is something that obviously the intelligence community is really happy with. But the foreign ministry is really happy with too, because it also means that the Turks have a continuing reason to be nice to the Russians.
Indeed.
So actually there's something of, I think, a consensus in decision-making circles about Rosatom's operations, not just in Turkey, as I say, but generally.
And the S-400s, I mean, if Turkey were to get rid of them somehow, would that really piss off Putin? Would he retaliate in some way?
I mean, would it piss him off? Well, probably. I suppose it depends also how. I mean, if it was get rid of them by giving them to the Americans so that they could reverse engineer and work out exactly how they work, then yes, that would be a big deal. If it was, I don't know, arranging some kind of sellback to the Russians or to someone whom the Russians were happy, so I don't know, let's say, Uzbekistan wanted to buy them, and Russia could bless the deal, then that will be fine. It's very much it's how it happens. But from the Russians' point of view, yes, they will be annoyed, but I think they will see and frame this actually as Turks had to bend to Western pressure rather than those bloody Turks. They did this a bad turn.
So what you've just said to me kind of suggests that for Erdogan it's really leverage with the West, or he sees it that way, which is why he's hanging on to them. It's not out of fear of what Putin might do to him if he did get rid of them.
Yeah.
That's very
much so. This is it. Erdogan has been playing the Russia card against the West quite sort of effectively. And look, there's a long tradition of using military. We think of military sort of sales as a way of, in which the seller acquires influence, which kind of they do. But it's actually also a massive way for the buyer to acquire leverage. This is why Saudi Arabia spends so much on kit that it can't use.
Right.
Because it knows that, every time the West starts getting antsy because some dissidents have been chopped up in an embassy, then it says, we're thinking of spending, for 100 billion on a new fighter plane. And suddenly everyone's all smiles and invitations to airfares. I think Erdogan understands this. But I think, again, the Russians are cynical and pragmatic enough to appreciate the situation too.
So my final question, the Muslim card, we all know that in the day Turkey was quite helpful, wasn't it, to the Chechens? And does that give Turkey some leverage, the fact that, well, first of all, it has this enormous pool now of fighters in Syria who get their paychecks from Ankara. Is there a fear in Russia that somehow they could go back, be used against Russia in some way, that there could be blowback, and that's another reason to keep Erdogan on an even keel?
I feel this is one of those kind of Quentin Tarantino scenarios where everyone's holding a gun on everyone else. Because yes, Turkey could play that card and say we're going to basically facilitate the transfer of fighters either into Russia or into areas from which they could affect Russian interests. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the Russians could say, those spunky Kurds, maybe it is time that we actually sort of, gave them a little bit more help, whether it's in, northern Syria or whether it's in Iraq, which clearly is something that would definitely alarm the Turks. And I suspect that at some point, both sides have found the opportunity to kind of lay out their own kind of option. This is one of these mutually assured destruction situations. Where yes, the Turks could cause the Russians trouble, but they know full well that it works the other way around too.
Well, yes, I guess that kind of sums it up. Well, thank you so very much.
Thanks for having me on your show.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amber Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts, along with first-class reporting and analysis.
And this brings us to the end of this week's podcast on the Middle East. Sorry for some of the salty language, and hope you enjoyed my conversation with Mark Galeotti as much as I did. Thank you and goodbye.